God's justice vindicated. Among the many and various teachings dispensed by Elijah to his friends, none were as important as his Theodicy, the teachings vindicating God's justice in the administration of earthly affairs. He used many opportunities to demonstrate it by precept and example. Once he granted his friend, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, the fulfillment of any wish he might express, and all the rabbi asked for was that he might be permitted to accompany Elijah on his wanderings through the world. Elijah would comply, but only on the condition that, however odd the rabbi might think Elijah's actions, he was not to ask any explanation of them. If he ever demanded why, they would have to part company. So Elijah and the rabbi journeyed on until they reached the house of a poor man, whose only earthly possession was a cow. The man and his wife were thoroughly good-hearted people, and they received the two wanderers with a cordial welcome. They invited the strangers into their house, gave them the best food and drink they had, and made up a comfortable couch for them for the night. When Elijah and the rabbi were ready to continue their journey the following day, Elijah prayed that the cow belonging to his host might die. Before they left the house, the animal had expired. Rabbi Joshua was so shocked by the misfortune that had befallen the good people that he almost lost consciousness. He thought, "Is that to be the poor man's reward for all his kind services to us?" And he could not refrain from putting the question to Elijah. But Elijah reminded him of the condition imposed and accepted at the beginning of their journey, and they traveled on, the rabbi's curiosity unappeased. That night they reached the house of a wealthy man, who did not even pay his guests the courtesy of looking them in the face. Though they passed the night under his roof, he did not offer them food or drink. This rich man wanted to have a wall repaired that had tumbled down. There was no need for him to take any steps to have it rebuilt, for when Elijah left the house, he prayed that the wall might erect itself, and lo, it stood upright. Rabbi Joshua was greatly amazed, but true to his promise, he suppressed the question that rose to his lips. So the two traveled on again until they reached a very ornate synagogue, the seats in which were made of silver and gold. But the worshippers did not correspond in character to the magnificence of the building, for when it came to the point of satisfying the needs of the way-worn pilgrims, one of those present said, "There's plenty of water and bread, so the strangers can stay in the synagogue, and these refreshments can be brought to them there." Early the next morning, when they were departing, Elijah wished for those present in the synagogue in which they had lodged that God might raise them all to be counselors. Rabbi Joshua again had to exercise great self-restraint and not put into words the questions that troubled him profoundly. In the next town, they were received with great affability and served abundantly with all that their tired bodies craved. On these kind hosts, Elijah, on leaving, bestowed the wish that God might give them but a single counselor. Now the rabbi could not hold himself in check any longer, and he demanded an explanation of Elijah's freakish actions. Although they would now have to separate, Elijah consented to clear up his conduct for Joshua. He spoke as follows: "The poor man's cow was killed because I knew that on the same day the death of his wife had been ordained in heaven, and I prayed that God would accept the loss of the poor man's property as a substitute for the poor man's wife. As for the rich man, there was a treasure hidden under the dilapidated wall, and if he had rebuilt it, he would have found the gold. Hence I set up the wall miraculously in order to deprive the curmudgeon of the valuable find. I wished that the inhospitable people assembled in the synagogue might have many counselors, for a place of numerous leaders is bound to be ruined by reason of multiplicity of counsel and disputes. To the inhabitants of our last sojourning place, on the other hand, I wished a single counselor, for if one wise one guides a town, success will attend all its undertakings. Know then, that if you see an evildoer prosper, it is not always to his advantage, and if a righteous man suffers need and distress, think not God is unjust." After these words, Elijah and Rabbi Joshua separated from each other, and each went his own way. Elijah proved to Rabbi Baruch how difficult it is to form a true judgment with nothing but external appearances as a guide. They were once walking in a crowded street, and the rabbi requested Elijah to point out any in the throng destined to occupy places in paradise. Elijah answered that there was none, only to contradict himself the very next minute and point out to a passerby. His appearance was such that to the rabbi he seemed the last one suspected to be a pious man. His dress did not even indicate he was a Jew. Later, Rabbi Baroka discovered by questioning him that he was a prison guard. In the fulfillment of his duties, he was particularly careful that the virtue of chastity should not be violated in the prison, in which both men and women were kept. Also, his position often brought him into relations with the heathen authorities, and so he was able to keep the Jews informed of the dispositions entertained toward them by the powers that be. The rabbi was thus taught that no station in life precluded its occupant from doing good and acting nobly. Another time, Elijah designated two men to whom a great future was assigned to paradise. Yet these men were nothing more than clowns. They made it their purpose in life to dispel discontent and sorrow by their jokes and their cheery humor, and they used the opportunities granted by their profession to adjust the difficulties and quarrels that disturbed the harmony of people living in close contact with each other. Elijah and the Angel of Death. Among the many benevolent deeds of Elijah, special mention ought to be made of his rescue of those doomed to fall into the clutches of the Angel of Death. He brought these rescues about by warning the designated victims of their impending fate and urging them to do good deeds, which would prove protection against death. There was once a pious and rich man with a beautiful and saintly daughter. She had the misfortune of losing 3 husbands in succession, each on the day after the wedding. Because of these sorrows, she decided never again to enter marriage. A cousin of hers, the nephew of her father, induced by the poverty of his parents, journeyed from his distant home to apply for help from his rich uncle. Scarcely had he laid eyes on his lovely cousin than he fell victim to her charms. In vain her father sought to dissuade his nephew from marrying his daughter, but the fate of his predecessors did not frighten him, and the wedding took place. While he was standing under the wedding canopy, Elijah came to him in the guise of an old man and said, "My son, I want to give you a piece of advice. While you are seated at the wedding dinner, you will be approached by a ragged, dirty beggar with hair like nails. As soon as you catch sight of him, seat him beside you, set food and drink before him, and be ready to grant whatever he may ask of you. Do as I say, and you will be protected against harm. Now I will leave you and go my way." At the wedding feast, a stranger, as described by Elijah, appeared, and the bridegroom did according to Elijah's counsel. After the wedding, the stranger revealed his identity, introducing himself as the messenger of the Lord sent to take the young husband's life. The supplications of the bridegroom failed to move him. He refused to grant even a single day's respite. All he yielded was permission for the young husband to bid farewell to his newlywed wife. When the bride saw that what she had feared was coming to pass, she went to the Angel of Death and argued with him. The Torah distinctly exempts the newlywed from all duties for a year. If you deprive my husband of life, you will give lie to the Torah. Then God commanded the Angel of Death to desist, and when the relatives of the bride came to prepare the grave for the groom, they found him well and unharmed. A similar thing befell the son of the great and extremely pious scholar Rabbi Reuben. To him the Angel of Death came and announced that his only son would have to die. The pious man was resigned. "We mortals can do nothing to oppose a divine decree," he said, "but I pray you, give him 30 days' respite, that I may see him married." The Angel of Death acquiesced. The rabbi told no one of his encounter, waited until the appointed time was drawing to a close, and on the very last day, the 30th, he arranged his son's wedding feast. On that day, the bridegroom-to-be met Elijah, who told him of his approaching death. A worthy son of his father, he said, "Who can oppose God? Am I better than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They too had to die." Elijah told him furthermore that the Angel of Death would appear to him in the guise of a ragged, dirty beggar, and he advised him to receive him in the kindliest possible manner and in particular he was to insist on his taking food and drink from him. All happened as Elijah had predicted, and his advice proved effective, for the heart of the angel of death, who finally revealed his identity, was softened by the entreaties of the father, combined with the tears of the young wife, who resorted to the argument cited above, of the year of exemption from duty granted to the newly married. The angel of death, disarmed by the kind treatment accorded to him, went before the throne of God and presented the young wife's petition. In the end, God added 70 years to the life of Rabbi Reuben's son. Teacher of the Kabbalah. The frequent meetings between Elijah and the teachers of the law during the Talmudic time were of personal interest only. Upon the development of the Torah they had no influence whatsoever. His relation to the mystic science was quite another matter. It is safe to say that what Moses was to the Torah, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. His earliest relation to it was established through Rabbi Ben Yohai and his son Rabbi Eliezer. For 13 years he visited them twice daily in their subterranean hiding place and imparted the secrets of the Torah to them. 1,000 years later, Elijah again gave the impetus to the development of the Kabbalah, for it was he that revealed mysteries, first to the Nazarite Rabbi Jacob, and then to the disciple of the latter, Abraham ben David. The mysteries in the books Peliah and Cana, the author Elkanah owed wholly to Elijah. He had appeared to him in the form of a venerable old man and imparted to him the secret lore taught in the heavenly academy. Besides, he led him to a fiery rock on which mysterious characters were engraved, which were deciphered by Elkanah. After his disciple had thus become thoroughly imbued with mystical teachings, Elijah took him to the tomb of the patriarchs, and then to the heavenly academy. But the angels, little pleased by the intrusion of one born of woman, inspired him with such terror that he begged Elijah to bring him back to earth. His mentor dispelled his fears and long continued to instruct him in the mystical science, the system his disciple recorded in his 2 works. The Kabbalists in general were possessed of the power to cite Elijah, to conjure him up by means of certain formulas. One of them, Rabbi Joseph de Lorena, once called on Elijah in this way, but it proved his own undoing. He was a saintly scholar, and he conceived no less a purpose than to bring about the redemption of man by the conquest of the angel Samael, the prince of evil. After many prayers, vigils, long fasting, and other ascetic practices, Rabbi Joseph united himself with his 5 disciples for the purpose of conjuring up Elijah. When the prophet, obeying the summons, suddenly stood before him, Rabbi Joseph spoke as follows: "Peace be with you, our master, true prophet, bearer of salvation. Be not displeased with me that I have troubled you to come. God knows I have not done it for myself, and not for my own honor. I am zealous for the name and the honor of God, and I know your desire is the same as mine, for it is your vocation to make the glory of God prevail on earth. I pray you, therefore, grant my petition. Tell me with what means I can conquer Satan." Elijah at first endeavored to dissuade the rabbi from his enterprise. He described the great power of Satan, ever growing as it feeds on the sins of mankind. But Rabbi Joseph could not be made to desist. Elijah then enumerated what measures and tactics he would have to observe in his combat with the fallen angel. He enumerated the pious saintly deeds that would win the interest of the archangel Sandalphon in his undertaking, and from this angel learn the method of warfare to be pursued. The rabbi followed out Elijah's directions carefully, and succeeded in summoning Sandalphon to his assistance. If he had continued to obey instructions implicitly, and had carried out all Sandalphon advised, the rabbi would have triumphed over Satan and hurried the redemption of the world. Unfortunately, at one point the rabbi committed an indiscretion, and he lost the great advantages he had gained over Satan, who used his restored power to bring ruin on him and his disciples. The radical transformation in the character of the Kabbalistic teaching, which is connected with the name of Rabbi Isaac Luria, likewise is an evidence of Elijah's activity. Elijah sought out this father of the Kabbalistic Renaissance and revealed the mysteries of the universe to him. Indeed, he had shown his interest in him long before anyone suspected the future greatness of the rabbi. Immediately after his birth, Elijah appeared to the father of the babe and enjoined him not to have the rite of circumcision performed until he had been told by Elijah to proceed. When the 8th day of the child's life arrived, the whole congregation was assembled at the synagogue to witness the solemn ceremony. But to the great astonishment of his fellow townsmen, the father delayed it. The people naturally did not know he was waiting for Elijah to appear, and he was called on again and again to have the ceremony take place. But he did not permit this impatience to turn him away from his purpose. Suddenly, Elijah, unseen, of course, by the others, appeared to him and told him to have the ceremony performed. Those present were under the impression that the father was holding the child on his knees during the circumcision. In reality, however, it was Elijah. After the rite was completed, Elijah handed the infant back to the father with the words, "Here is your child. Take good care of him, for he will spread a brilliant light over the world." It was also Elijah who in a similar way informed Rabbi Eliezer, the father of the Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the father of him whose name is unrivaled in the annals of the Hasidic Kabbalah, that a son would be born to him who would enlighten the eyes of Israel. This Rabbi Eliezer was justly reputed to be very hospitable. He was in the habit of stationing guards at the entrances to the village in which he lived, and they were charged to bring all strangers to his house. In heaven, it was ordained that Rabbi Eliezer's hospitable instincts should be put to the test. Elijah was chosen for the experiment. On a Sabbath afternoon, arrayed in the garb of a beggar, he entered the village with a knapsack and staff. Rabbi Eliezer, taking no notice of the fact that the beggar was desecrating the Sabbath, received him kindly, attended to his bodily wants, and the next morning, on parting with him, gave him some money besides. Touched by his kind-heartedness, Elijah revealed his identity and the purpose of his disguise, and told him that as he had borne the trial so well, he would be rewarded by the birth of a son, who should enlighten the eyes of Israel. As Elijah's participation in the course of history is many-sided, it still cannot be compared with what he is expected to do in the days of the Messiah. He is charged with the mission of ordering the coming time and restoring the tribes of Jacob. His messianic activity is thus twofold. He will be the forerunner of the Messiah, yet in part he will himself realize the promised scheme of salvation. His first task will be to induce Israel to repent when the Messiah is about to come, and to establish peace and harmony in the world. Hence, he will have to settle all legal difficulties that have accumulated since the beginning of man's days, and decide difficult questions concerning contradictory views of God's purpose. In short, all differences of opinion must be removed from the path of the Messiah. This office of expounder of the law Elijah will continue to occupy even after the reign of peace has been established on earth, and his relation to Moses will be the same as Aaron once held. Elijah's preparatory work will begin 3 days before the advent of the Messiah. Then he will appear in Palestine and will lament over the devastation of the Holy Land, and his wail will be heard throughout the whole world. The last words of his eulogy will be, "Now peace will come to earth." When the pious hear this, they will rejoice. On the second day, he will appear again and proclaim, "Good will come on earth." And on the third, his promise will be heard, "Salvation will come on earth." Then Michael will blow the trumpet, and once more Elijah will make his appearance, this time to introduce the Messiah. To make sure of the identity of the Messiah, the Jews will demand he perform a miracle of resurrection before their eyes, reviving the dead that they had known personally. But the Messiah will do the 7 following wonders. He will bring Moses and the generation of the desert to life. Korah and his band will rise from out of the earth. He will revive the Ephraimitic Messiah, who was slain. He will show the 3 holy vessels of the temple, the ark, the flask of manna, and the cruse of sacred oil, all 3 of which had previously disappeared mysteriously. He will wave the scepter given him by God. He will grind the mountains of the Holy Land into powder like straw, and he will reveal the secret of redemption. Then the Jews will believe that Elijah is the Elijah promised to them, and the Messiah introduced by him is the true Messiah. Then Messiah will have Elijah blow the trumpet, and at the first sound, the primal light, which shone before the week of creation, will reappear. At the second sound, the dead will arise, and with the swiftness of wind, assemble around the Messiah from all corners of the earth. At the third sound, the Shekinah will become visible to all. The mountains will be raised at the fourth sound, and the temple will stand in complete perfection, as Ezekiel described it. During the reign of peace, Elijah will be one of the 8 princes forming the cabinet of the Messiah. Even the coming of the great day of judgment will not end his activity. On that day, the children of the wicked, who had to die in infancy on account of the sins of their fathers, will be found among the just, while the fathers will be ranged on the other side. The babes will implore their fathers to come to them, but God will not permit it. Then Elijah will go to the little ones and teach them how to plead in behalf of their fathers. They will then stand before God and say, "Is not the measure of good, the mercy of God, larger than the measure of chastisement? If then we died for the sins of our fathers, should they not now for our sakes be granted the good and be permitted to join us in paradise?" God will give assent to their pleadings, and Elijah will have fulfilled the words of the prophet Malachi. He will have brought back the fathers to the children. The last act of Elijah's brilliant career will be the execution of God's command to slay Samael, and so banish evil forever. Elisha, the disciple of Elijah. The voices of the thousands of prophets of his time were stilled when Elijah was translated from earth to heaven. With him vanished the prophetic spirit of those who in former times had been in no way his inferior. Elisha was the only one among them whose prophetical powers were not diminished. On the contrary, they were strengthened, as a reward for the readiness with which he obeyed Elijah's summons, and left the field he was plowing and all he possessed in favor of the community. From then on he remained Elijah's unwearying companion. When the angel first descended from heaven to take Elijah from earth, he found the two so immersed in a learned discussion that he could not attract their attention, and he had to return, his errand unfulfilled. Elijah's promise to bestow a double portion of his wondrous spirit on his disciple was realized instantaneously. During his life, Elisha performed 16 miracles, and 8 was all his master had performed. The first of them, the crossing of the Jordan, was more remarkable than the corresponding wonder done by Elijah, for Elisha traversed the river alone, and Elijah had been accompanied by Elisha. 2 saints always have more power than one. His second miracle, the healing of the waters of Jericho so that they became fit to drink, resulted in harm to himself, for the people who had earned their livelihood by the sale of wholesome water were very much incensed against the prophet for having spoiled their trade. Elisha, whose prophetic powers enabled him to read both the past and the future of these tradesmen, knew that they, their ancestors, and their posterity had not even the aroma of good about them. Therefore he cursed them. Suddenly a forest sprang up, and the bears that infested it devoured the murmuring traders. The wicked fellows were deserving of the punishment they received. Yet Elisha had to undergo a very serious sickness by way of correction for having yielded to passion. In this he resembled his master Elijah. He allowed wrath and zeal to gain mastery over him. God wanted the 2 prophets to be purged of this fault. Accordingly, when Elisha rebuked King Jehoram of Israel, the spirit of prophecy forsook him, and he had to resort to artificial means to reawaken it. Like his teacher, Elisha was always ready to help the poor and needy. As witness, his sympathy with the widow of one of the prophets, and the effective aid he extended to her. Her husband had been none other than Obadiah, who, though a prophet, at the same time had been one of the highest officials at the court of the sinful king Ahab. By birth an Edomite, Obadiah had been inspired by God to utter the prophecy against Edom. In his own person, he embodied the accusation against Esau, who had lived with his pious parents without following their example, while Obadiah, on the contrary, lived with the iniquitous king Ahab and his still more evil spouse Jezebel, without yielding to their influence. This same Obadiah not only used his own fortune, but went to the length of borrowing money on interest from the future king in order to have the wherewithal to support the prophets who were in hiding. On Obadiah's death, the king wanted to hold the children responsible for the debt of the father. In her despair, the pious wife of Obadiah went to the graveyard, and there she cried out, "Oh, you God-fearing man!" At once a heavenly voice was heard. "There are 4 God-fearing men, Abraham, Joseph, and Obadiah. To which of them do you want to speak?" She answered, "To him of whom it is said, 'He feared the Lord greatly.'" Then she was led to the grave of Obadiah, where she poured out the tale of her sorrow. Obadiah told her to take the small remnant of oil she had to the prophet Elisha and request him to intercede with God. "For God," he said, "is my debtor, seeing that I provided 100 prophets not only with bread and water, but also with oil to illuminate their hiding place. For do not the scriptures say, 'He that has pity on the poor lends to the Lord'?" The woman carried out his request. She went to Elisha, and he helped her by making her little pot of oil fill vessels on vessels without number. And when the vessels gave out, she fetched broken pots, saying, "May he that made empty vessels full make broken vessels perfect." So it was. The oil ceased to flow only when the supply of pots as well as vessels gave out. In her piety, the woman wanted to pay her tithe offering, but Elisha was of the opinion that, as the oil had been bestowed on her miraculously, she could keep it wholly and entirely for her own use. Furthermore, Elisha reassured her as to the power of the royal princes to do her harm. "The God who will close the jaws of the lions said on Daniel, and who closed the jaws of the dogs in Egypt, the same God will blind the eyes of the sons of Ahab and deafen their ears so that they can do you no harm." Not only was the poor widow helped out of her difficulties, her descendants to all times were provided for. The oil rose in price, and it yielded so much profit that they never suffered want. The Shunammite. The great woman of Shunem, the sister of Abishag, and the wife of the prophet Iddo, also had cause to be deeply grateful to Elisha. When Elisha came to Shunem on his journey through the land of Israel, his holiness made a profound impression on her. Indeed, the prophet's eye was so awe-inspiring that no woman could look him in the face and live. Contrary to the habit of most women, who are intent on diminishing their expenses in their toil, she took delight in the privilege of welcoming the prophet to her house as a guest. She observed that not even a fly dared to approach the holy man, and a graceful fragrance exhaled from his person. "If he were not so great a saint," she said, "and the holiness of the Lord did not invest him, there would be no pleasant fragrance about him." That he might be undisturbed, she assigned the best chambers in the house to the prophet. On his part, desiring to show his appreciation for her hospitality, he could think of no better return for her kindness than the promise that she would be blessed with a child within a year. The woman protested, "My husband is an old man, and I am also too old to bear children. The promise can't be fulfilled." Yet it happened as the prophet foretold. Before 12 months had passed, she was a mother. A few years later, her child died a sudden death. The mother went to the prophet and lamented, "If only I had remained empty, rather than I bear a child and then be left void." The prophet admitted that, though as a rule he was acquainted with all things that were to happen, God had left him in the dark about this misfortune. With trust in God, he gave his staff to his disciple Gehazi and sent him to bring the boy back to life. But Gehazi was unworthy of his master. His conduct was not becoming of a disciple of the prophet, and, above all, he had no faith in the possibility of accomplishing the mission entrusted to him. Instead of obeying Elisha, not to speak a word on his way to the child, Gehazi made sport of the task. Whenever he met a man, he asked the question, "Do you suppose this staff can bring the dead back to life?" The result was that he forfeited the power of executing the errand with which he had been charged. Elisha himself had to perform the miracle. The prophet uttered the prayer, "O Lord of the world," As you did wonders through my master Elijah and permitted him to bring the dead to life, so I pray you, perform a wonder through me, and let me restore life to this lad." The prayer was granted and the child was revived. The act of the prophet proves the duty of gratitude in return for hospitality. Elisha never attempted to resuscitate his own kith and kin who had been claimed by death, but he invoked a miracle for the sake of the woman who had welcomed him kindly into her house. Next, Gehazi. End part 85 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.